I spent about 5 minutes before recording this trying to work out a joke about how this video will be face-meltingly good, but I couldn't, so let's just get straight into it. Just before we get started, if you guys want to have a go at this yourself, I've got a Patreon for $1 where you can get all of the project files from all of my videos. So if you're fairly new to Blender and couldn't do this on your own, you can just download my files and get started straight away. On with the video! The first thing I did to melt my face was bring in the base mesh of a human, and then I deleted everything except for the head, obviously, because that's all I needed. I then went into sculpt mode and flattened a load of the features because I wanted it to feel like the face had kind of melted away so there wasn't like a defined nose or eye sockets anymore. Once that was done, the sculpt was really high poly, so I exported an OBJ and then took it into instant meshes and made a remesh of it that was much more low poly. I made sure to have enough faces that I could still do a bit of sculpting with it because I was going to use a few shape keys to do the face melting into the eye sockets effect. Once that was done, I brought the new retopologized mesh back in and then started working on it. I added one subdivision surface modifier to just add a little bit more detail because I found it wasn't quite enough. Then I added two shape keys. The first is the base shape and then the second one is the completely melted eye sockets that I sculpted. Then once this is all done, I can use the slider to go between the two positions and the eyes kind of melt away. I jumped onto textures.com and found some textures of some meat, which I was just going to use as like a base shader to go under all of the burnt effects that I was doing later. I also found a rock brush that looked a little bit like a burnt sort of texture, so I started using that to sculpt around the eyeballs to add a more organic feeling to it. It made it nice and bumpy and kind of gave it that charred burnt look, which looks really cool. I made sure to turn off symmetry at one point so that it wasn't exactly the same mirrored across both sides. And I did this with the brush set to anchor so that I could put my mouse somewhere, click and then drag outwards and have lots of nice control over where the brush was actually going. The material for this is essentially loads of noise textures on top of each other and then a couple of PBR setups as well. I started off by making the fleshy texture that went underneath like I showed earlier. It's a seamless texture, so I just scaled it up to the point where it looked pretty good, and then that was my base shader done. I did a couple of things like adding a little bit more contrast and stuff into it with a RGB curves node, but I pretty much left it as it was. You can see here I've put an emission shader in the back of the eye sockets, but I didn't bother going with that in the end. I also brought in this skull, which I also decided to get rid of in the end because it wasn't really working. But the idea with this was that once the skin of the eyes melts away, it starts to reveal the bone a bit. But when I was compositing the two layers together, I couldn't really get the skull to kind of merge with the face in a way that looked convincing. It just looked like it was a render layer sat on top. I used a vector displacement node to add some uneven organic looks to the whole surface of the skin, which worked really nicely. I had to turn it down really far because as you can see here, it's going a bit nuts. So here I'm starting to build up a couple of extra noise textures on top. I made one that was almost like some glowing embers that was stuck on the surface of the skin. This one's going on the inside of the eye sockets and it's going to be the actual sort of burning magma-y texture inside the eyes. So I went quite small with the scale of the noise and then added some lava-y textures into the color ramp to make it a little bit orange. I then used a larger noise texture on top of that, which I multiplied over the first one. I like to use multiple noise textures and multiply them together when I'm using stuff with noise because I always find that the kind of procedural look of the noise really stands out. But if you use a bigger one and a smaller one and multiply them together, you end up with less of the even uniform look over the whole thing, and some areas have more frequency noise, some areas have less, and it works nicely. Here I'm painting a black and white matte for the eye socket so I can define what parts of the texture go where. I tried to use this just selecting the faces and pressing assign, which is a little bit easier, but it wasn't really working, so I ended up just painting some mattes for it instead. So now if I use a mix shader and combine the two, you can see we have the flesh on the outside and then the glowing embery burnt texture on the inside of the eye sockets. And then here I'm making one more noise texture. This is going to be a load of really small high frequency kind of embers dotted around the edges of the eyes. The look I was going for here was kind of like after a fire dies out and there's just a few glowing specks on the ends of the sticks and stuff that have been burning in the fire. Again, I used two noise textures and then multiplied them together, which gave me that slightly more uneven, less uniform look, which I really like. And then I just played around with the coordinates until I found something I liked and then used another mix shader to combine them together. A lot of the depth to this look just comes from slapping loads and loads of different noise textures on top of each other, which is quite fun. Then I jumped onto Texture Haven and grabbed this ground texture that I found. It had a load of little stones and stuff in it that I thought looked quite good for a burnt bone flesh kind of feel. And then I used some nodes in the shader editor to just make it a bit darker. So my plan was to have 3 layers of texture to this really. The inside of the eye sockets will be glowing and have that magma-y look, and then around the edges of the eye sockets will be the rock texture that's going on in a second. And then the very edges will be the flesh texture, almost like the skin is just burnt away from the surface but it hasn't gone through much of the meat of the face yet. So this is the ground texture that I've just brought in. As you can see, it wasn't really quite looking right until I started to make it a lot darker, and now it has that kind of burnt, charred look to it, which looks really cool. I had to tweak the roughness and stuff to get it in the right place, but it was pretty easy to make it look nice. Once I liked the look of it, I made a second image texture and painted another matte for the edges of the eye sockets to define where this texture was going to go. Originally I used a brush, then I thought it wouldn't look very good for the fall off, so I started using that rock brush that I had earlier to add some sort of organic detail into the texture of this matte. And this worked really nicely. It makes it feel more organic because you have some of the underlying texture that comes through where the brush is a bit darker, and then obviously you have the bits that are completely opaque. So once that was done, I saved the image and then used it to combine all three of the layers together, and this is what it started to look like. And then finally I started painting a transparency texture. The idea is that the whole shader for the head will be combined with a transparent shader, and this will be used as the factor, which means that basically anything outside of the eye sockets will be transparent, so all I'm really rendering is a kind of Robin style superhero mask that just goes around the eye sockets. And then when I'm compositing this in Nuke, I can just put it over the footage of my face, and I won't have to worry about drawing any masks to define where the edges go, because the render will have it built in. So here you can see when I start doing some test renders, the rest of the head becomes see-through. So once all that was ready to go, the next job was to actually do an object track of my face so that this would stick. I made some tracking markers by cutting up some little bits of blue painter's tape and sticking them on my face. This may seem a little bit DIY, but it's actually a really good idea because blue is the opposite to red on the colour wheel. So if you track the red channel on its own, the blue markers will be almost completely black and your skin will be completely white. And that makes a load of contrast, which makes the tracking a lot easier. So I just did a really simple track of all the points on my face, then added a camera and added the camera tracker constraint to it, and then enabled motion tracking in the viewport so I could see the points. Then I brought in the head from the other Blender file, including all of the textures and everything. Then I brought in my background footage through the camera so that I could line it up properly. And then once that was all done, I just added the object tracker constraint onto the head, and now it will stick to the tracking points. So that's pretty much it for the Blender stuff. I rendered all of this to a multi-layer EXR and turned on things like the emission pass so that I could add some glow when I'm doing the compositing. This is also the first time I used the optics denoiser in Blender, and I have to say I'm mega impressed. It's really, really good. Highly recommend everyone starts using it. So now we're going to jump into Nuke very quickly to slap everything together. So while the render was going in Blender, off camera I tracked all of the tracking markers on my face independently in Nuke, and then just used a transform mask to move a section nearby of my skin over the top, and now all the tracking markers are gone. I also did a quick key of the green screen version of me that was in both of the shots. I didn't really realise until after I'd shot this, but the lighting on the green screen was horrendous, so this is probably one of the worst keys I've ever done in my visual effects career. But luckily, because it's going to be defocused a little bit in the foreground, you don't really notice it. You can see how horrible the edge is on that key there. Once the key was done, I put myself over the footage and then started working on the laser eyes. The lasers are really simple. It's basically just a lightsaber effect. So I made a couple of rotor shapes coming out of my eyes, going into the eye of the other me, and then feathered them a little bit coming towards the camera just to give them a bit of shape. And then I added an exponential glow, which obviously adds a bit of glow and makes them look all cool. Added a grade node and then changed the gamma a little bit to add some colour into the glow. Then I added a turbulent displace node, which is based off the same effect in After Effects, and it does exactly the same thing. It's just distorting the image with some noise. Then it just has some animations so the noise moves over time. After that I started dropping in the renders from Blender. The first thing I did was just match the black points, which is really important for blending CG into live action footage. And then I started doing some of the cool stuff, like separating out the emission pass and adding some glows onto it and then plussing it back on top of the original footage. This just gives it some intensity, which looks really nice. Here I'm just animating the laser eyes to move with my eyes over the course of the shot. I added some light wrap from the lasers onto the foreground version of me, where the lasers are really intense. You can start to see the light coming around the side of my head. Then I found this green screen blood run effect. Originally I tried to do this as a liquid sim in Blender, but I just couldn't really get it working, so I just decided to find a 2D element instead. So I just matched some of the colours of the highlights and stuff and then tracked it onto my face, on my cheek. And then just to make the contact with my face feel a bit more realistic, I offset it by a few pixels and then just used that alpha to grade the footage down slightly to make a drop shadow effect. Then a couple of little final details. I added some veins coming out of the side of my face. I just did a planar track on my cheek to get a corner pin and then just stuck some PNGs that I found online of some vein textures over the top. In the screen recording here they're black, but in the end I actually ended up making them white, which kind of felt like the light from the laser beams was kind of seeping into my veins, which looked quite cool. And I used a mask to kind of reveal them outwards over the course of the shot, so it feels like they're creeping over my forehead, which is quite fun. Adding some finishing touches, I keyed the highlights of my face and then put some of the light interaction from the lasers onto my skin tones, and then used a noise modifier so it would flicker a little bit. And then I was lying in bed quite late the night after finishing this shot thinking it was missing something, and I realised there should be some smoke coming out of the eyes, which would look hilarious. So I jumped back into Blender and did a quick smoke sim for just 2 emitters for the eye sockets, and over the course of the shot they just emit some smoke, which looks really fun. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the finished shot. If you haven't seen The Boys on Amazon, that was the inspiration for this shot. There's a very similar thing that I wanted to try and recreate. Highly recommend it, but it's very gory, so if you're under 18, then maybe not. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.